Hey guys, tonight we're about to embark on a journey that takes us back to the ancient world, where vast deserts and rugged mountains connected civilizations through an epic trade route. The Silk Road, though not one singular road, but a network of ancient trade paths, transformed societies in ways we're still feeling today. From the bustling markets of Central Asia to the palaces of China, the Silk Road was a bridge, both literally and figuratively, between the East and the West. It brought with it an exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures that shaped the course of history. But let me give you a little warning, my friend, you might be in for a surprise. You see, the Silk Road was anything but glamorous. It was a vast, dangerous stretch of land, full of mystery and uncertainty. If you had lived back then, the chances are you wouldn't have survived the journey. In fact, you'd likely be trudging through a vast desert under the hot sun, or navigating treacherous mountain passes while hoping that nothing went wrong. Still, people made it. And they made it with a simple yet profound purpose: trade, exchange, and survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and hey, drop your location and the time right now in the comments. Let's see where our journey takes us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Silk Road, how did it come to be? You might think it started with a well-placed map, but that's not how it happened. Instead, it was born out of necessity and survival. Ancient civilizations, looking for ways to trade and connect, had no choice but to venture into the unknown. They crossed rivers, crossed deserts, and passed through mountain ranges so treacherous that only the bravest, and often the most desperate, would dare to take the journey. Historians still argue whether the creation of the Silk Road was inevitable. Was it the result of a grand plan, or did it develop more organically, as traders sought ways to connect and expand? Regardless of the answer, this web of trade routes stretched more than 4,000 miles, reaching from China in the east to the Mediterranean world in the west. It didn't just carry goods, but also transformed cultures, economies, and even beliefs across entire continents. By the time the Silk Road reached its peak, it was far more than a collection of roads. It was a vital lifeline between civilizations. But before all that, it had humble beginnings. The trade routes that eventually became known as the Silk Road were initially small, isolated pathways. It wasn't until the Han Dynasty in China started pushing westward that the Silk Road began to take its more recognizable shape. The Han, driven by a thirst for resources, didn't just want to trade, they wanted to expand. And expand they did, forging connections with kingdoms in Central Asia, all the way to the Roman Empire. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive deeper into how the Silk Road truly took shape and how it began to transform the ancient world. The creation of the Silk Road wasn't just the result of chance, it was a calculated effort by the Han Dynasty in China, who needed more than just trade routes. They needed a lifeline to the West, a way to exchange silk, spices, and precious goods with the Roman Empire. The Han didn't just stumble into this network. They actively sought out diplomatic connections with nomadic tribes and empires to ensure they could trade freely and without fear of interruption. You see, China, with its booming economy, was brimming with riches that the West had never seen: silk, for one, which was so precious that the Romans didn't even know how it was made at first. Historians still argue whether the Romans initially thought the silk came from trees or were simply too awestruck to ask. As the routes expanded, the Silk Road turned into an intricate system of paths connecting not only China with Rome, but also the Parthian Empire, India, and various states in Central Asia. This allowed for an unprecedented exchange of goods, each society offering something unique. The Parthians, for instance, controlled the heart of the Silk Road, acting as intermediaries between East and West, making a fortune as traders passed through their empire. They had horses, high-quality leather, and glassware items that were highly valued by the people of the West. But here's where it gets interesting. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for material goods. It became the thread weaving together diverse cultures, religions, and ideas from all over the world. That's right, while merchants were hauling silk, spices, and ivory across the desert, philosophers and religious figures were doing their own trading along these same routes. Buddhism, for instance, traveled from India to China, while Greek philosophy reached the Indian subcontinent and beyond. Historians still debate the extent to which these religious exchanges shaped the civilizations along the Silk Road. Did Buddhism truly flourish in China because of this cross-cultural dialogue, or was it always destined to find a home there? Regardless, the truth remains clear. The Silk Road was not just about goods, it was about people sharing ideas, technologies, and beliefs. As these routes connected different worlds, it was impossible for them not to influence each other in profound ways. Take, for example, the incredible art that emerged from these exchanges. Chinese porcelain made its way to the Roman Empire, and Roman glass was sought after in the East. Over time, these objects became more than just commodities, they were symbols of cultural sophistication, treasured by both the rich and the common folk alike. But let's not forget that the Silk Road was a dangerous, unpredictable beast. The vastness of the routes meant that people had to cross perilous terrain. You might have heard of those caravans that risked crossing the Samarkand desert, where temperatures could soar to unbearable levels by day and plummet dangerously low at night. If you thought you could just take a leisurely stroll through the desert with a nice little picnic, think again. This wasn't a relaxing walk in the park, it was survival. And the people who braved these roads were often faced with more than just environmental hazards. The Silk Road was plagued by bandits who saw these caravans as nothing more than easy prey. Now that we've painted a picture of the Silk Road's beginnings, its economic impact, and its cultural exchanges, let's explore some of the more intriguing aspects of the Silk Road, particularly the kinds of goods and ideas that moved along these ancient trade routes. At its peak, the Silk Road wasn't just a conveyor belt for luxury items. It was a place where everyday goods were exchanged, changing the material culture of societies. Yes, silk was at the top of the list, hence the name Silk Road. But the true beauty of the Silk Road lies in its wide array of traded items. For instance, China didn't just send silk westward, they sent tea, porcelain, and paper, all of which transformed the Western world. Tea was so prized that it became more valuable than gold in some circles. Can you imagine paying for something as humble as tea with a sack of gold? Yet, that was the case for many wealthy Roman citizens. On the flip side, the West had its own treasures to share. The Romans sent glassware, wine, and their own specially crafted weapons along the route. But it wasn't just physical items that traveled. Precious stones, like diamonds and jade, made their way back and forth, signaling the growing importance of luxury items in both Eastern and Western courts. As these goods traveled, they carried with them cultural values, transforming not only the way people dressed and ate, but also how they thought. Historians still debate whether these material exchanges had a deeper impact on how societies viewed wealth. Was the trade of luxury goods a symbol of the growing materialism in both Eastern and Western societies, or were these goods seen purely as status symbols in a world where only the elite could afford them? Some believe that the Roman obsession with silk was a symbol of this shift, a way for the elite to assert their power and status over others. Others argue that it was more about the sheer wonder of foreign, exotic items, a way to show the world that their empire could dominate in trade, culture, and luxury. And as goods moved, so did new ideas. Just as merchants traveled with their goods, they traveled with stories, philosophies, and beliefs. For example, we can trace the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road, but did you know that the first contact between Buddhist monks and the people of China didn't come in one grand meeting? Instead, it was a slow trickle of travelers and traders bringing the faith over several centuries. Over time, Buddhist scriptures were translated into Chinese, and the teachings began to take root in the minds of the Chinese people. As a result, China became one of the world's largest centers of Buddhism, a major influence on art, philosophy, and culture in the region. But it wasn't just Buddhism that made its way along these trade routes. Christianity found its place along the Silk Road too. As the Roman Empire spread, so did its religious beliefs. By the time the Roman Empire fell, Christianity had taken root in places as far east as Persia, where Nestorian Christianity thrived in the early centuries. The journey of these ideas wasn't always smooth. Often, these beliefs collided with local religions and philosophies. Yet, this constant exchange was part of what made the Silk Road so revolutionary. The Silk Road wasn't just about commerce, it was about cross-pollination, a mutual exchange of not only material wealth, but also intellectual and spiritual wealth. The spread of Islam across the Silk Road in the 7th century was another major turning point. As Muslim merchants and travelers set up shop across the Silk Road, They brought with them new ideas in science, mathematics, and architecture. Islamic scholars, often ahead of their time in the fields of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, shared their knowledge along the way, creating a bridge between the East and West. And let's not forget the stunning mosques, with their intricate tilework and architectural styles that arose along the Silk Road, serving as both religious centers and markers of Islamic influence. As we continue along our journey, let's dive into one of the most fascinating aspects of the Silk Road, the role of Central Asia. This vast, often overlooked region, with its sweeping deserts and towering mountains, was the heart of the Silk Road, where goods, people, and ideas met in a complex dance of commerce and culture. Central Asia was the key to the success of the Silk Road. Why? Because this was the region where East and West converged. It was here that the great empires of the East, China, Persia, and India encountered the powerful kingdoms of the West, like Rome and Byzantium. Central Asia, particularly the areas that are now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, was an absolute melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. The cities in this region, like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva, became some of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan hubs of the ancient world. These cities were crucial stopovers for travelers, as they served not just as markets but as places of learning, where scholars from different cultures shared ideas and discoveries. It's incredible to think about how much these cities shaped the world as we know it. Samarkand, for instance, was once one of the most celebrated cities in the world. It was the jewel of the Timurids, where the famous ruler Timur, or Tamerlane, established his empire. The city was a center for scientific knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, and art. Historians still argue over whether it was the wealth of Samarkand that made it a hub of learning, or whether it was the region's unique blend of cultures that fostered such intellectual exchanges. What we do know is that Samarkand became an intellectual crossroads where ideas from India, China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world merged into one incredible tapestry. Of course, these cities weren't just about commerce or intellectual pursuits. They were also about survival. The Silk Road was filled with dangers, bandits, harsh weather, and political instability. Traveling through the vast steppes and deserts of Central Asia required incredible endurance, and the people of this region had to be experts in navigating these challenges. Central Asian traders, who became known for their knowledge of the terrain, would guide caravans through the harsh desert routes, ensuring safe passage. The caravanserais, large roadside inns, offered traders and travelers a place to rest and trade goods in peace. What makes the role of Central Asia even more fascinating is its diverse population. The people who lived in these regions weren't just one homogeneous group. They were a mix of Turkic nomads, Persians, Arabs, and even Chinese merchants who had settled along the route. This diversity didn't just exist in the people, it extended to the food, language, and customs. Each group brought its own flavor to the Silk Road experience, creating a unique blend of traditions, clothing, and of course cuisine. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road would have had the same impact without Central Asia. Some believe that the exchange of goods and ideas could have happened with or without the region. Others argue that Central Asia was indispensable, as it provided the only route that connected both the East and West. What we do know is that without Central Asia, the Silk Road wouldn't have been as successful, and the civilizations of the world might never have had the chance to encounter one another in such meaningful ways. So next time you think about the Silk Road, remember that it wasn't just about China or Rome. It was about the crossroads, where everything came together in a mix of trade, culture, and survival. It's a fascinating story of how Central Asia, a region that often gets overlooked in history, became the backbone of one of the most transformative trade routes the world has ever known. Now that we've explored the pivotal role of Central Asia, let's turn our attention to one of the most fascinating and influential cultures along the Silk Road, Rome, and its insatiable demand for silk. You see, silk wasn't just a commodity for the Romans. It became a symbol of wealth, power, and luxury. But how did Rome, which had never seen a silkworm, come to fall in love with this delicate fabric? And why was silk so highly prized in a world where even gold wasn't as valuable? It all began when Roman emissaries encountered the Chinese silk trade. Initially, the Romans thought silk came from trees. Imagine how shocked they must have been to discover it came from tiny, wriggling worms. For the Romans, silk wasn't just fabric, it was a marvel of the East. You could find silk garments worn by emperors, senators, and the rich elite. And it wasn't just about fashion. Silk was a status symbol that distinguished the upper echelons of Roman society. In fact, the demand for silk became so high that the Roman Emperor Tiberius famously warned his citizens not to waste money on it. But the Romans couldn't resist after all. Once you've seen a finely woven silk robe, it's hard to go back to wool. Historians still debate how much silk trade truly influenced the Roman economy. Some believe that silk, as a luxury commodity, had a small impact on the Roman economy, only benefiting the upper classes. Others argue that the wealth created by this trade played a role in Rome's eventual decline, as the constant outflow of gold to purchase silk contributed to economic instability. The constant demand for luxury goods like silk fueled inflation and drained resources, leading to a growing divide between the rich and the poor. In a way, the pursuit of silk created an economic cycle that, while profitable for some, ultimately contributed to the collapse of one of history's greatest empires. But the Romans weren't alone in their obsession with silk. The Byzantine Empire, which rose from the ashes of Rome, also became heavily involved in silk production. Interestingly, it was the Byzantine Emperor Justinian who is credited with smuggling silkworms out of China, forever changing the silk industry. He sent his spies to the east, where they managed to steal silkworm eggs and bring them back to the empire. From there, the Byzantines began to cultivate silk on their own soil, and soon they were not only consuming silk, but also producing it, making the Byzantine Empire one of the main centers of silk manufacturing in the medieval world. The Silk Road wasn't just about the exchange of material goods, it was about control over those goods. And the trade routes that made their way from the east to the west became more than just paths. They were the lifeblood of the ancient world's most powerful empires. Silk became a currency in its own right. Rome's obsession with silk created an economic relationship with China that spanned centuries, and even when the Roman Empire fell, the silk trade didn't stop, it only shifted. This centuries-old obsession with silk shows just how powerful the Silk Road was. It wasn't merely a trade route for spices and silk, it was a bridge between civilizations, making its way into the heart of empires. It became not only a vital source of wealth, but a symbol of the power and cultural prestige that came from controlling these precious trade routes. Now that we've covered the profound influence of silk on the ancient empires, let's look at something else that made the Silk Road truly remarkable: the flow of knowledge, technologies, and innovations across continents. Yes, goods were traded, but so were ideas and breakthroughs that forever changed the way civilizations lived, thought, and interacted with the world around them. One of the most important contributions was the transmission of Chinese inventions to the West. For instance, the art of papermaking was one of China's most influential exports. Before the invention of paper, civilizations used cumbersome materials like papyrus or parchment to record information. But once the Chinese perfected paper, the West began to adopt this incredible technology, which revolutionized communication, education, and the preservation of knowledge. Imagine how different the Renaissance would have been without paper. Historians still argue whether the spread of papermaking was a key factor in the acceleration of the European Enlightenment, but there's no denying the pivotal role this invention played in the world's intellectual development. Then, there was the spread of printing technology, another game changer. The Chinese had perfected movable type printing long before Gutenberg's famous press in the 15th century. But it was through the Silk Road that the technique made its way westward, paving the way for mass production of books and the eventual explosion of knowledge in Europe. Imagine, before this, books were painstakingly copied by hand. The printing press made knowledge accessible to the masses, forever altering education, literature, and even religion. It's safe to say that without the Silk Road, the world's intellectual landscape would have looked very different. Beyond the realm of paper and print, the Silk Road also brought the Western world into contact with Chinese medicine. Concepts such as acupuncture, herbal remedies, and even the use of certain medical plants made their way westward along the trade routes. It wasn't just about the physical items like spices and silk, it was about sharing knowledge that could save lives. These ancient Chinese medical practices eventually influenced European herbalism and became part of the global medical lexicon. Historians still argue over how much Eastern medicine influenced Western practices, but one thing is certain: the Silk Road acted as a conduit for knowledge. Without the trade of ideas and innovations, much of what we consider standard knowledge today would have been delayed for centuries, if not longer. While the West was busy building its empires, the East had been quietly advancing in science, medicine, and technology, sharing those innovations with the world in the most unexpected ways. But let's not overlook the contribution of Islamic scholars. As Islam spread across the Silk Road, Muslim merchants and travelers brought with them incredible advances in mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. They were instrumental in preserving and building upon the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Indians. The Islamic world preserved important classical texts and translated them into Arabic, where they were further developed and passed on to Europe during the Renaissance. In fact, many of the astronomical advancements that we take for granted today, such as the understanding of the stars and planets, were introduced to the West by Muslim scholars. The impact of these scientific exchanges was immense, from the development of algebra and calculus to the expansion of astronomical knowledge. The Islamic Golden Age, which spanned roughly from the 8th to the 14th centuries, was directly connected to the Silk Road and the flow of ideas across the East and West. Through the Silk Road, knowledge didn't just flow one way, it went both directions, creating an intellectual exchange that spanned continents and centuries. At the same time, artistic traditions were also exchanged across the Silk Road. Silk Road art is a fascinating study in cultural fusion. The style of art that developed in Central Asia, China, and Persia was influenced by Greek, Indian, and Chinese traditions. Buddhist art, for instance, showed the blending of Greek and Indian styles, creating an entirely new genre of art that reflected the interconnectedness of the ancient world. Iconic figures like the Buddha were depicted with Greek features, showing how cultures adapted and transformed each other's images. So, while we often focus on the tangible goods that traveled the Silk Road, silk, spices, and tea, let's not forget that the exchange of knowledge, culture, and technology was just as important. The Silk Road was not just a highway for merchants, but a bridge for ideas, philosophies, and innovations that would change the world forever. As we continue our exploration of the Silk Road, it's time to turn our attention to the very cities that thrived along this ancient network of trade routes. These cities weren't just stopping points, they were the heartbeats of the Silk Road, where the exchanges of goods, ideas, and cultures came alive in vibrant marketplaces and bustling streets. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Damascus weren't just famous for their wealth. They became centers of intellectual thought, artistic innovation, and cultural blending. One of the most famous cities along the Silk Road was Samarkand, located in present-day Uzbekistan. Samarkand, with its strategic location at the crossroads of major trade routes, became a prosperous cultural hub. It was here that Central Asia's rich history of art, literature, and science flourished. When Tamerlane, conquered Samarkand in the 14th century, he transformed it into a grand capital, complete with stunning architectural wonders like the Registan Square and the Bibi Khanim Mosque. These buildings became iconic representations of the city's wealth and importance. Yet Samarkand's real treasure lay not in gold, but in its role as a cultural melting pot, where Persian, Turkish, and Mongol influences fused to create a unique style of art and architecture. Historians still argue whether Samarkand's transformation under Timur's rule was primarily a product of conquest and power, or if it was driven by the city's existing status as a trading and intellectual center. Regardless, Samarkand remains an enduring symbol of the Silk Road's ability to turn humble cities into centers of cultural dynamism. This city wasn't just about wealth, it was about exchange. Ideas, goods, and people from all corners of the ancient world converged here, creating a rich tapestry of culture, religion, and learning. Bukhara, another key city along the Silk Road, shares a similar story. Like Samarkand, Bukhara was known for its wealth, but its true significance lay in its role as a spiritual and intellectual hub. Bukhara was home to some of the most important Islamic scholars, who not only preserved ancient knowledge but advanced it. The city's madrasas, Islamic schools, became famous throughout the Muslim world for producing some of the most respected scholars of their time. The exchange of knowledge in these cities wasn't limited to trade. It included the great ideas that traveled across borders, from science and astronomy to philosophy and religion. But the Silk Road cities weren't all about academic and artistic pursuits. They were also bustling marketplaces where goods from all over the world were bought and sold. For merchants, these cities were not just stops on a long journey, they were opportunities to make their fortunes. The goods sold in Samarkand and Bukhara weren't limited to the high-value items we often think of, like silk or spices. These cities were also centers for the exchange of everyday goods like textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. As traders from different parts of the world gathered, these cities also became places where people could experience the richness of other cultures, from the food they ate to the languages they spoke. Damascus, in Syria, was another critical city along the Silk Road. Unlike Samarkand and Bukhara, Damascus was already an established metropolis by the time the Silk Road reached its peak. Its significance didn't come from being a new city, but from its established infrastructure and role as an entry point to the Mediterranean. Damascus was renowned for its high-quality steel, which became famous throughout the ancient world. In fact, the term Damascus steel was synonymous with a type of steel known for its strength and ability to hold a sharp edge. This expertise in metallurgy made Damascus a highly sought-after destination for traders, warriors, and craftsmen alike. But what truly set Damascus apart was its ability to adapt. The city played a central role in the Islamic Golden Age, becoming a seat of knowledge and culture. It was here that scholars, philosophers, and scientists gathered to share ideas, making the city a hub for intellectual exchange. Much like Samarkand and Bukhara, Damascus was a crossroads, a place where East met West, where cultures collided and created something new. Historians still argue whether Damascus's significance was due to its geography, its status as an intellectual center, or simply its ability to adapt to the ever-changing tides of history. It's important to remember that while these cities were centers of culture, commerce, and innovation, they were also places of danger. The Silk Road was not a safe place. Merchants and travelers had to contend with unpredictable weather, harsh terrain, and of course, bandits. The caravanserais, roadside inns where traders and travelers could rest, were critical to ensuring the safety of these long journeys. These establishments provided more than just shelter. They acted as safe havens where caravans could regroup, repair their goods, and prepare for the next leg of their journey. In fact, the role of caravanserais in fostering trade cannot be overstated. They were often strategically located at regular intervals along the Silk Road, ensuring that traders could travel in relative safety. These caravanserais weren't just places to sleep, they were bustling marketplaces in their own right, where goods were traded, ideas were shared, and friendships were forged. They were the lifeblood of the Silk Road, helping to ensure that the great trade network continued to function. As we delve deeper into the stories of the Silk Road, it's impossible to ignore the tremendous impact it had on art and culture. The exchange of goods wasn't the only thing that traversed the ancient world. Ideas, styles, and artistic techniques made their way across continents, weaving together a tapestry of influences that forever altered the artistic landscapes of both East and West. Let's start with the Chinese influence on art. As the Silk Road carried goods from China to the West, it also carried the intricate art forms that the Chinese had perfected over millennia. The fine art of Chinese porcelain, for instance, became so highly prized in the West that it was considered one of the ultimate luxuries. Roman elites in particular couldn't get enough of it. Roman merchants sought out the finest Chinese porcelain, and by the time it reached the Mediterranean, it was regarded as a symbol of wealth and refinement. The sheer beauty and quality of the porcelain made it highly coveted, and it was traded alongside silk, spices, and other valuable commodities. Historians still debate the full impact of Chinese porcelain on Western art. Was the demand for Chinese porcelain simply a fad among the wealthy, or did it truly inspire Western artists to develop their own forms of ceramics? What we do know is that the artistic techniques involved in creating porcelain were closely guarded secrets in China for centuries. When the West eventually learned how to create similar porcelain in the 18th century, it revolutionized the ceramics industry. But the influence didn't stop there. As the Silk Road connected artists and craftsmen from all parts of the ancient world, new artistic traditions began to emerge. One of the most interesting exchanges occurred between the Greco-Roman world and the regions of Central Asia. Central Asia, home to cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, became a crossroads for not just goods, but artistic ideas. These cities were places where Greek artistic traditions mingled with Persian, Indian, and Chinese styles. The result? A rich and unique form of art that combined the best aspects of all these traditions. One of the most striking examples of this fusion is the art of Buddhist sculpture, which was heavily influenced by Greco-Roman styles. When Greek and Roman artists came into contact with Indian art through the Silk Road, they began to adopt and adapt Indian religious motifs. The result was a new form of Buddhist art that featured Greco-Roman style drapery and facial features, blending the artistic traditions of the Mediterranean with the spiritual themes of Buddhism. This fusion of styles became particularly evident in the Gandhara region, which is now part of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. Historians still debate how much influence the Greeks had on Buddhist art. Did the Greek invasion of India during Alexander the Great's campaign influence this artistic transformation, or did the cultural exchange happen organically as the Silk Road facilitated more contact between the East and West? Regardless of the answer, what we know for sure is that the Silk Road didn't just carry material goods, it carried artistic styles, philosophies, and techniques that shaped the visual culture of the ancient world. In addition to art, the Silk Road also had a profound impact on architecture. As the cultures of the East and West merged, architectural styles began to reflect this blending. The famous domes of Islamic architecture, for example, were influenced by Persian and Central Asian designs, which in turn were influenced by Greek and Roman techniques. Similarly, the majestic palaces and mosques built along the Silk Road were a blend of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian architectural styles, creating a new, unique style that we now recognize as characteristic of the Silk Road. One of the most enduring symbols of Silk Road architecture is the caravanserai. These roadside inns, built at regular intervals along the Silk Road, were essential for the success of long-distance trade. Not only did they provide shelter for travelers, but they were also architectural marvels in their own right. Many caravanserais featured elaborate courtyards, ornate gateways, and large halls that could accommodate dozens of merchants and their animals. These structures were designed to withstand the harsh conditions of the desert and the mountains, and they became symbols of the Silk Road's enduring influence on the ancient world. As we look at these examples, it's clear that the Silk Road wasn't just about the exchange of commodities. It was about the exchange of ideas, cultures, and artistic traditions. And though the road itself may no longer be traveled in the same way, the cultural exchange it facilitated continues to shape the world today. Whether it's through the art we admire, the architecture we live in, or the philosophies that guide us, the Silk Road's legacy is still alive and well. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's cultural impact was as significant as its economic one. Did the exchange of ideas truly shape the world in the same way that the exchange of goods did? The answer is likely both yes and no. The economic exchange made the Silk Road possible, but it was the cultural exchange that gave it lasting significance. Without the fusion of cultures, religions, and artistic traditions, the Silk Road would have been nothing more than a series of trade routes. As we reach the final stretch of our journey along the Silk Road, it's time to address a significant and often overlooked aspect of the trade route, the decline of the Silk Road itself. While we've spent much of our time marveling at the wealth, knowledge, and cultural exchange it enabled, it's important to understand that the Silk Road didn't remain a constant. Like all things in history, it eventually fell into decline due to a combination of political, environmental, and economic factors. One of the major reasons for the decline of the Silk Road was the rise of new empires and the shifting political landscape. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the Byzantine Empire took its place, the political stability that had once supported trade along the Silk Road started to falter. The rise of the Sassanid Empire in Persia, as well as the increasing dominance of the Islamic caliphates, brought new power dynamics to the region, shifting trade routes and altering the flow of goods. What had once been a relatively stable trading network became increasingly fragmented, with rival empires vying for control over critical routes. At the same time, the Mongol invasions in the 13th century created even more chaos along the Silk Road. While the Mongols initially revived trade by creating the vast Pax Mongolica, which allowed for the free movement of goods and ideas across Eurasia, this period of relative stability didn't last. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured into smaller khanates, each with its own interests and conflicts, further destabilizing the Silk Road and making travel increasingly dangerous. The rise of piracy, political instability, and the threat of war made the once thriving trade routes increasingly unappealing to merchants. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Mongols were responsible for the decline of the Silk Road. Some believe that their empire played a key role in revitalizing trade, while others argue that the subsequent fragmentation of the Mongol Empire accelerated the decline of the trade network. Regardless of who or what is to blame, the decline of the Silk Road was inevitable. The rise of maritime trade routes, particularly during the age of exploration, offered new, safer, and more efficient ways to transport goods across long distances. As sea routes became more prominent, the land-based Silk Road slowly faded from the global map. The invention of the compass, the expansion of shipbuilding technologies, and the growth of European colonial powers all contributed to this shift. While the land routes were still used for a time, the emergence of maritime trade created a new world order, rendering the old Silk Road less essential for international commerce. The environmental factors also played a role in the Silk Road's decline. The harsh desert landscapes, particularly in Central Asia, were difficult to navigate and hostile to life. The once thriving oases and caravanserais that dotted the desert were slowly disappearing due to shifting trade routes and changing climate conditions. Many of the cities that had once flourished along the Silk Road, like Palmyra and Petra, fell into ruin, unable to adapt to the changing political and economic landscape. But the story of the Silk Road doesn't end with its decline. While the physical trade routes may have waned, the cultural, intellectual, and artistic exchanges that the Silk Road facilitated never truly disappeared. The ideas, philosophies, and innovations that traveled along these ancient paths continued to shape the world long after the caravans stopped rolling. The Silk Road's influence can still be felt today in the arts, sciences, and religions of the modern world. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Silk Road marked the end of an era or the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The reality is likely somewhere in between. The fall of the Silk Road didn't signal the end of cross-cultural exchange, it simply shifted from one mode of communication to another. The world had changed, but the legacy of the Silk Road lived on, influencing the ways people interacted, traded, and shared ideas for centuries to come. As we reflect on the decline of the Silk Road, it's important to recognize that while the ancient trade routes may have faded, their legacy continued to shape the course of history. The Silk Road didn't just connect people for a few centuries, it laid the groundwork for the global interconnectedness that we experience today. It was one of the first instances of widespread cross-cultural exchange, where goods, ideas, and technologies flowed between distant civilizations. Even after its physical decline, the concepts of global trade and cultural exchange persisted, eventually influencing the rise of the modern world. Take, for example, the enduring impact of the Silk Road on modern trade networks. Today, the world is more connected than ever before, with goods and services moving across continents at an unprecedented rate. While we no longer rely on the perilous desert routes or traverse mountains on camelback, the principles of international trade that were first established on the Silk Road remain the same. Just as merchants once traveled vast distances to exchange silk and spices, today we exchange everything from electronics to food to information. Historians still debate the full impact of Chinese porcelain on Western art. Was the demand for Chinese porcelain simply a fad among the wealthy, or did it truly inspire Western artists to develop their own forms of ceramics? What we do know is that the artistic techniques involved in creating porcelain were closely guarded secrets in China for centuries. When the West eventually learned how to create similar porcelain in the 18th century, it revolutionized the ceramics industry. But the influence didn't stop there. As the Silk Road connected artists and craftsmen from all parts of the ancient world, new artistic traditions began to emerge. One of the most interesting exchanges occurred between the Greco-Roman world and the regions of Central Asia. Central Asia, home to cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, became a crossroads for not just goods, but artistic ideas. These cities were places where Greek artistic traditions mingled with Persian, Indian, and Chinese styles. The result? A rich and unique form of art that combined the best aspects of all these traditions. One of the most striking examples of this fusion is the art of Buddhist sculpture, which was heavily influenced by Greco-Roman styles. When Greek and Roman artists came into contact with Indian art through the Silk Road, they began to adopt and adapt Indian religious motifs. The result was a new form of Buddhist art that featured Greco-Roman style drapery and facial features, blending the artistic traditions of the Mediterranean with the spiritual themes of Buddhism. This fusion of styles became particularly evident in the Gandhara region, which is now part of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. Historians still debate how much influence the Greeks had on Buddhist art. Did the Greek invasion of India during Alexander the Great's campaign influence this artistic transformation, or did the cultural exchange happen organically as the Silk Road facilitated more contact between the East and West? Regardless of the answer, what we know for sure is that the Silk Road didn't just carry material goods, it carried artistic styles, philosophies, and techniques that shaped the visual culture of the ancient world. In addition to art, the Silk Road also had a profound impact on architecture. As the cultures of the East and West merged, architectural styles began to reflect this blending. The famous domes of Islamic architecture, for example, were influenced by Persian and Central Asian designs, which in turn were influenced by Greek and Roman techniques. Similarly, the majestic palaces and mosques built along the Silk Road were a blend of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian architectural styles, creating a new, unique style that we now recognize as characteristic of the Silk Road. One of the most enduring symbols of Silk Road architecture is the caravanserai. These roadside inns, built at regular intervals along the Silk Road, were essential for the success of long-distance trade. Not only did they provide shelter for travelers, but they were also architectural marvels in their own right. Many caravanserais featured elaborate courtyards, ornate gateways, and large halls that could accommodate dozens of merchants and their animals. These structures were designed to withstand the harsh conditions of the desert and the mountains, and they became symbols of the Silk Road's enduring influence on the ancient world. As we look at these examples, it's clear that the Silk Road wasn't just about the exchange of commodities. It was about the exchange of ideas, cultures, and artistic traditions. And though the road itself may no longer be traveled in the same way, the cultural exchange it facilitated continues to shape the world today. Whether it's through the art we admire, the architecture we live in, or the philosophies that guide us, the Silk Road's legacy is still alive and well. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's cultural impact was as significant as its economic one. Did the exchange of ideas truly shape the world in the same way that the exchange of goods did? The answer is likely both yes and no. The economic exchange made the Silk Road possible, but it was the cultural exchange that gave it lasting significance. Without the fusion of cultures, religions, and artistic traditions, the Silk Road would have been nothing more than a series of trade routes. As we reach the final stretch of our journey along the Silk Road, it's time to address a significant and often overlooked aspect of the trade route, the decline of the Silk Road itself. While we've spent much of our time marveling at the wealth, knowledge, and cultural exchange it enabled, it's important to understand that the Silk Road didn't remain a constant. Like all things in history, it eventually fell into decline due to a combination of political, environmental, and economic factors. But Marco Polo wasn't alone. Along the Silk Road, there were countless other travelers who contributed to the exchange of knowledge between East and West. Some were traders, like the Chinese merchant Zhang Qian, whose travels to Central Asia in the 2nd century BCE opened up the first official trade routes between China and the West. Others were scholars and missionaries, such as the Nestorian Christians who traveled from Persia to China, spreading Christianity and exchanging ideas about philosophy, science, and medicine. Perhaps one of the most significant groups of travelers were the Muslim merchants who played a crucial role in the Silk Road's success. As Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula, its influence began to reach all corners of the Silk Road. Muslim merchants and scholars were instrumental in fostering trade, facilitating cultural exchange, and even contributing to the development of new technologies, like the astrolabe, which helped sailors navigate the seas. These merchants weren't just carrying goods, they were carrying the wealth of knowledge, science, and technology from one world to another. These travelers, whether they were seeking wealth, knowledge, or religious converts, were essential to the functioning of the Silk Road. Their encounters with other cultures led to the creation of the world's first truly global network, where ideas and people from disparate backgrounds could meet, interact, and exchange their wisdom. But while these stories of adventure and discovery are fascinating, it's important to remember that life on the Silk Road was not all glamorous. For the average merchant, the journey was long and grueling, filled with danger at every turn. From crossing scorching deserts to navigating treacherous mountain passes, travelers faced an endless array of obstacles. And while some returned home with wealth and fame, many others never made it back, lost to the harsh realities of the road. Historians still debate how much of the Silk Road's success was due to the individual effort of these intrepid travelers, and how much was due to the networks of political power that supported them. Was the Silk Road's prosperity driven by the ambition of individuals, or was it a product of the larger geopolitical structures that made trade possible? The answer is likely a combination of both. While the travelers themselves were the ones who physically crossed vast distances and faced incredible risks, it was the backing of powerful empires like the Mongol Empire, the Tang dynasty in China, and the Byzantine Empire that ensured the Silk Road's success. Regardless of the exact reasons for its success, one thing is clear. The Silk Road was built on the backs of these brave men and women, whose journeys brought the world closer together in ways that were unimaginable at the time. Their stories are as much a part of history as the goods they traded, and without them, the Silk Road would not have been the monumental achievement that it was. So, next time you read a story of a traveler from the ancient world, remember that their journey was not just a path between 2 points, it was a journey that changed the world forever. They crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, connecting people who had never before had the chance to meet. They made the Silk Road what it was, and their legacy continues to shape the way we interact with the world today. As we look back on the long and winding history of the Silk Road, we begin to understand that its influence stretches far beyond the ancient world. Even though the physical trade routes faded away centuries ago, the exchange of ideas, culture, and goods left a profound legacy that still resonates in the modern world. Today, we often take for granted the global connections that shape our lives, everything from the food we eat to the technology we use. But these connections, as vast and intricate as they are, can trace their roots back to the Silk Road. One of the most enduring aspects of the Silk Road is the legacy of cross-cultural exchange. While we often think of trade in terms of material goods, the Silk Road was more than just a conveyor belt of silk and spices. It was a meeting place for cultures, religions, and philosophies. The blending of ideas, beliefs, and customs that took place along the Silk Road helped to shape the world's major religions and cultures. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam all found their way along these trade routes, with each belief system influencing the societies they touched. Buddhism, for example, traveled from India to China, Korea, and Japan along the Silk Road. It didn't just move as a religious doctrine, it adapted, evolved, and integrated with the cultures it encountered. Buddhist monks traveled with their scriptures, their teachings, and their way of life, spreading the faith across Asia. But Buddhism didn't just stay within the confines of religious temples. It influenced art, architecture, literature, and philosophy, becoming a central part of the cultural fabric of many Asian civilizations. Similarly, Christianity spread along the Silk Road, though its journey was more complex. The earliest Christian missionaries made their way from the Roman Empire into Persia and Central Asia, establishing communities that would later become important centers of Christian life in the region. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Nestorian Christianity, an early branch of the Christian faith, spread as far as China, leaving its mark on art and culture in the regions it touched. While Christianity didn't take hold in the same way as Buddhism, its presence along the Silk Road is a testament to the power of cultural exchange. And let's not forget Islam, which was carried along the Silk Road by Muslim traders and missionaries. As the Islamic caliphates expanded, so did their influence along the Silk Road. Muslim scholars contributed to the preservation and expansion of knowledge, especially in fields like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The influence of Islam along the Silk Road didn't just shape the religion's followers, it also influenced the cultures and societies they encountered, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Central Asia, Persia, and even parts of China and India. But perhaps one of the most surprising legacies of the Silk Road is its impact on the global economy. As the Silk Road connected East and West, it laid the foundations for the modern system of global trade. The exchange of goods, from silk to spices to precious metals, created an intricate web of commerce that linked distant lands. Even today, we see echoes of this interconnectedness in our modern supply chains, international markets, and economic policies. Historians still debate the extent to which the Silk Road directly influenced the rise of modern trade networks. Some argue that the development of sea trade routes, particularly during the Age of Exploration, overshadowed the role of the Silk Road in shaping global commerce. Others contend that the economic systems that emerged from the Silk Road laid the groundwork for today's global trade. Regardless of the exact timeline, one thing is certain: the Silk Road's role in fostering global connections is undeniable. And yet, it wasn't just about wealth, it was about the flow of knowledge, innovation, and ideas. The Silk Road facilitated the exchange of technologies that would later change the world, from the art of papermaking and printing to the spread of new agricultural practices. The techniques used to create paper, which originated in China, spread along the Silk Road and eventually reached the Islamic world and Europe, revolutionizing communication and record keeping. The exchange of ideas wasn't limited to trade and commerce. Philosophies, scientific discoveries, and artistic traditions flowed freely along the Silk Road. It was along these paths that ancient knowledge from Greek, Indian, Persian, and Chinese thinkers was preserved, translated, and transmitted to new audiences. In many ways, the intellectual legacy of the Silk Road shaped the foundations of the modern world, inspiring the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution. As we look at the world today, it's easy to forget how far we've come since the days of the Silk Road. The digital age has connected us in ways that the ancient traders could have never imagined. And yet, we still rely on the same principles that the Silk Road embodied: trade, exchange, and collaboration. The Silk Road was one of the first true examples of a global network, and its impact continues to be felt in our daily lives. Historians still debate how much the ancient Silk Road truly influenced the modern world. Was it a direct precursor to today's globalized economy, or was its impact more subtle and indirect? What we do know is that the Silk Road was a pivotal moment in history, one that laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we live in today. It was a world where ideas, goods, and people could move freely across vast distances, and it's a legacy we continue to build upon. As we approach the final stretches of our journey, it's time to consider the rich legacy of the Silk Road's decline. While we've talked extensively about the peak of the Silk Road, its fading into history offers just as much to reflect on. Its eventual collapse marked the end of an era, one where continents were connected by the steady flow of goods, ideas, and cultures. However, the story of the Silk Road didn't simply end with its decline. Its influence was long-lasting, and in many ways, the end of the Silk Road laid the foundations for new global connections. After the fall of the traditional Silk Road routes, global trade didn't come to a halt, it merely shifted. The rise of the maritime Silk Road, led by seafaring powers like Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch, completely reshaped the dynamics of world trade. The discovery of sea routes to Asia, most notably the route around the Cape of Good Hope to India, brought a fresh era of global exploration. This maritime expansion opened up vast new markets for trade, and in many ways, the Silk Road's decline directly contributed to the eventual development of the modern, oceanic trading systems that we see today. Historians still argue about the exact transition from the land-based routes of the Silk Road to the maritime routes of the Age of Exploration. Some suggest that the maritime Silk Road was simply a natural evolution of the land routes, while others argue that the collapse of the Silk Road spurred new innovations and technologies, including the development of larger and more capable ships. Regardless of the specifics, what is clear is that the end of the Silk Road didn't mean the end of global exchange. It only marked a shift in how that exchange happened. As the Silk Road's land routes diminished, so too did the great cities that once thrived on its trade. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Damascus, once bustling hubs of commerce and culture, slowly fell into decline. The loss of trade and political instability took their toll. Yet, while these cities may have lost their economic importance, they retained their cultural and intellectual legacies. The rich cultural exchanges that took place along these roads didn't vanish. Instead, they took root in other parts of the world, influencing new generations of thinkers, artists, and leaders. The legacy of the Silk Road's cultural exchange was perhaps most visible in the emergence of the Renaissance in Europe. During this period, many of the ideas that had traveled along the Silk Road, whether through Islamic scholars or Chinese inventions like gunpowder, paper, and the compass, began to find their way into Europe's intellectual landscape. The great works of classical antiquity, preserved and passed on by scholars from Persia and the Arab world, became integral to the intellectual revival that characterized the Renaissance. This intellectual movement, fueled in part by the exchanges that began on the Silk Road, helped to spark the modern era of science, art, and philosophy. Meanwhile, the influence of the Silk Road also spread into other areas. The introduction of exotic goods like tea, spices, and silk didn't just change the world of the rich and powerful, they impacted everyday life. These goods became a part of daily rituals, with tea drinking becoming embedded in the cultures of Europe and later the Americas. In some cases, the commodities that once passed along the Silk Road came to represent entire cultures, such as the enduring love of tea, silk garments, and spices in both the East and the West. What makes the legacy of the Silk Road so fascinating is how it continued to evolve long after the physical trade routes disappeared. The flow of goods, the exchange of philosophies, and the blending of cultures never truly stopped. They simply adapted to new methods of interaction. Today, we live in a world where trade and cultural exchange are more interconnected than ever, thanks to technology and the global economy. While it's easy to see the end of the Silk Road as a simple historical event, in truth, it set in motion a new age of global connections that has continued to evolve to this day. Historians still argue over whether the decline of the Silk Road was the beginning of modern globalization or merely a temporary pause in the ongoing exchange between cultures. Some argue that the rise of global trade networks, especially the maritime routes, was the true beginning of globalization, while others contend that the Silk Road laid the foundations for the interconnected world we live in today. One thing is certain, the decline of the Silk Road didn't mean the end of the story. It was simply a new chapter in the ongoing saga of human connection. The legacy of the Silk Road, in many ways, lives on in how we view the world today. We live in a world where goods and ideas flow freely across borders, where we can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the globe. In this sense, the spirit of the Silk Road still exists. The road may have disappeared, but the exchanges it facilitated continue to shape the way we live, think, and trade. As we conclude our journey through the history of the Silk Road, it's important to reflect on the broader impact this ancient trade network had on shaping the world as we know it today. While the Silk Road may have physically disappeared centuries ago, its cultural, economic, and intellectual legacies have only continued to expand. It's astonishing to consider how this ancient system of exchange, with its risks and rewards, laid the groundwork for modern globalization. The first, and perhaps most lasting, legacy of the Silk Road is the idea of interconnectedness. The routes that stretched across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe allowed for the first time in human history the kind of widespread, continuous exchange of goods, knowledge, and ideas that we now take for granted. The flow of goods, like silk, spices, and tea, wasn't just about trade, it was a symbol of the human desire to connect, learn, and understand one another across vast distances. This quest for connection and shared knowledge was the foundation upon which much of today's globalized economy rests. The Silk Road didn't just connect the East with the West, it created a space where cultures could interact, learn from each other, and sometimes even clash. The stories, languages, and philosophies that traveled along the Silk Road didn't just survive, they flourished and evolved. Many of the religious and intellectual movements that shaped the ancient world, such as Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, used the Silk Road as a conduit for spreading their beliefs and influencing other cultures. Without this shared space for cultural exchange, it's likely that many of these movements wouldn't have reached the far-flung corners of the world where they eventually took root. Even the arts and sciences were profoundly impacted by the Silk Road. The Greek ideas of geometry, philosophy, and medicine didn't just stay in the West, they made their way eastward, where they were preserved and built upon by Islamic scholars. The Renaissance, often seen as a turning point in Western civilization, was made possible by the preservation and advancement of ancient knowledge facilitated by the Silk Road. The legacy of the Silk Road's intellectual exchanges lives on today, in our libraries, universities, and research institutions, where ideas that first traveled along these ancient paths continue to inspire new generations of thinkers. And then, of course, there is the enduring legacy of trade itself, the very concept of global trade, where goods and services flow across borders and continents, can trace its origins to the Silk Road. The goods that were exchanged along these routes, silk, spices, gold, and more were the foundation of modern supply chains, the precursors to today's global marketplace. While we no longer use camels and caravans to transport our goods, the spirit of trade that the Silk Road embodied continues to shape our world. Today, as we live in a world that is more connected than ever, with trade routes that span the globe and instant communication between continents, the essence of the Silk Road still influences how we interact with the world. We no longer need to travel thousands of miles over treacherous landscapes to exchange goods. We can do it at the touch of a button. But just as the traders, scholars, and adventurers of the past connected distant cultures through their journey along the Silk Road, we too continue to shape a world of interconnectedness and exchange. Historians still debate the full extent of the Silk Road's long-term impact. Was it the driving force behind the development of global trade, or was it just a precursor to the modern systems that followed? What's certain is that the Silk Road, in its heyday, provided a model for the global trade routes we rely on today. The commerce that occurred along these routes laid the foundation for the modern international economy, while the cultural exchanges that took place along the way helped to foster a sense of shared human experience across vast distances and varied civilizations. The modern world may be more connected than ever, but it's easy to forget that these connections began with the ancient world's first great trade network. The legacy of the Silk Road is alive in our everyday lives, whether in the products we buy, the foods we eat, or the technologies we use. The Silk Road didn't just shape the ancient world, it continues to shape ours, serving as a reminder of what we can achieve when we come together to exchange, learn, and grow. So, the next time you sip a cup of tea, admire a piece of fine silk, or hear a story from another culture, take a moment to think about the Silk Road. Though the physical roads may no longer exist, the connections it created are still very much alive, influencing everything from global trade to cultural exchange. The Silk Road was more than just a trade route, it was the world's first true global network, and its legacy continues to shape our world today. And so, we come to the final chapter of our journey along the Silk Road, where the past and the present meet in a fascinating reflection on the road's enduring legacy. The rise and fall of the Silk Road may seem like ancient history, but the connections forged along this vast network of trade routes still echo in our modern world. Whether it's through the goods we trade, the ideas we share, or the cultures we celebrate, the spirit of the Silk Road is still very much alive today. As we look at the global economy, it's impossible not to see the profound influence of the Silk Road in the systems we use to exchange goods across borders. Today, the networks of global trade that have replaced the old routes of the Silk Road are more intricate than ever. The development of modern supply chains, international trade agreements, and digital technologies has created a world where goods and services flow seamlessly from one country to another, much as they did along the Silk Road centuries ago. But despite the technological advancements, the fundamental principles that guided ancient trade are still in place, a world interconnected by the exchange of resources, culture, and ideas. Similarly, in the world of culture, the legacy of the Silk Road continues to shape the way we view art, literature, and religion. The Silk Road was a place where East met West, and the artistic traditions, religious beliefs, and intellectual pursuits of different civilizations were blended and exchanged. These interactions didn't just change the societies involved, they helped shape the global cultural landscape. From the fusion of Buddhist and Greco-Roman art in Central Asia to the spread of paper and printing technology from China to Europe, the Silk Road's influence can still be seen in the way cultures exchange and borrow from each other today. One of the most striking aspects of the Silk Road's legacy is the way it reshaped our understanding of human connection. The very idea of global connectivity of people and ideas moving across vast distances was born on the Silk Road. Today we live in a world where it's easier than ever to communicate with someone on the other side of the globe, whether it's through digital media, social platforms, or international conferences. The world feels smaller, more interconnected, because we've inherited the same spirit of exchange and connection that the Silk Road embodied. Historians still debate the lasting impact of the Silk Road on today's world, but one thing is certain: the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures along these ancient routes set the stage for the interconnected global society we live in today. The history of the Silk Road is a history of human progress, innovation, and collaboration, where different civilizations came together to share their knowledge and resources. It reminds us that, even in the most difficult times, people have always found ways to connect, communicate, and learn from one another. This spirit of mutual exchange is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. As we reach the end of our journey, take a moment to appreciate the connections you share with the world around you, whether it's through the products you buy, the ideas you exchange, or the cultures you engage with. The Silk Road may have been a product of its time, but its legacy continues to shape the world in ways that are still unfolding. The spirit of the Silk Road lives on in the globalized world we navigate today, and its influence will continue to shape the course of history for generations to come. Now, as we wind down from our historical adventure, I want to leave you with a final thought. The Silk Road wasn't just about trade or conquest, it was about human connection. It was about people from different corners of the world coming together to share, learn, and grow. And in today's world, as we continue to build bridges across cultures and continents, we are, in many ways, continuing the work that the travelers of the Silk Road began so many centuries ago. So as you close your eyes and drift off to sleep tonight, think about the legacy of the Silk Road and the ways in which it continues to shape our world today. Let it remind you that no matter how distant we may seem from one another, we are all connected by the same threads of history, culture, and shared human experience.